I always had a plan, not some vague set of dreams, not a beautiful but unrealistic lifestyle from the advertising brochures of mortgage banks, but a verified, precise, scrupulously calculated plan, to which I went in small steps, almost imperceptible to others, but so significant for me, while everyone around me seemed to live for today, dissolving in spontaneous purchases, sudden trips, signing up for courses to their liking and endless parties on Fridays. I, as if going against the current, remained true to my goal aimed at the future, where I, Mimi, will finally cross the threshold of my own home, the key to which will belong only to me. Hi, my name is Mimi, I'm 30 years old, and for more than 5 years I've been saving every penny for a down payment on this very house, not a villa by the ocean, not a penthouse in the center of a metropolis, but a modest but reliable house in which I can breathe freely, without looking back at the rent schedule and without counting how many days are left until the next paycheck. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. It was not easy. This word does not have enough letters to convey all the fatigue that has become my constant companion over the years, all the internal struggle that I waged every time I wanted to just quit everything, spend my savings on a vacation that I've been dreaming about since I was 25, or buy myself a new coat instead of altering the lining of the old one for the third time. I live in a small one-room apartment, where the closet is right next to the bed, and the kitchenette is so cramped that if you open the refrigerator, you have to push a stool under the table. Rent eats up too much of my monthly income, but I make it work, like an old watch that's been wound and kept dust-free. I pick up extra shifts at the marketing firm where I work as a content manager, sometimes working 12 hours a day just to hit my quarterly targets and get a bonus, which I immediately put away in a separate account. I haven't been on vacation in years. Even a short weekend in a neighboring city seems like an unaffordable luxury to me. My wardrobe consists of exactly 7 work outfits and 5 casual ones, all carefully chosen, all mix and match. And I know this not by hearsay but by careful accounting. I've calculated how much clothing I need for a year so as not to look sloppy, but also not to waste money. My family thinks I'm crazy, probably because they expect women to spend their money on dresses, perfume, and salons, not on construction estimates and mortgage calculators. Mimi, are you wearing that blue blouse again? My sister Eleanor asked me at our last family barbecue, raising an eyebrow as if I'd committed some kind of social crime. I swear you had that when Obama was president. Eleanor is 40 and married to Romeo, a big-name but soft-spoken man who almost always sits in the corner with his phone and doesn't chime in on conversations. They have a 17-year-old son, Christian, a tall, quiet guy with kind eyes and a habit of writing things down in a notebook. Eleanor had always been the golden child, the favorite, the life of every family gathering, the one praised for winning the Olympics, for her successful marriage, for roasting a perfectly roasted turkey. I was not. I was always in the background, not because I was inferior, but because I was quieter. It still fits and it's not torn, I said, trying to sound neutral as I scraped the potato salad onto my plate, not really paying attention to the sympathetic looks from my relatives. Why would I buy another one? Eleanor laughed, looking around for support, and sure enough, she found it. Normal people don't wear the same clothes for 10 years. My father chuckled, not looking up from his plate. Mimi always saves money? You know you can't take it with you when you die, right? I straightened up, answering as calmly as I could. I'm not planning on dying anytime soon. I'm just planning on getting my own home someday. My mother, standing next to the grill, sighed dramatically, in the way that only mothers can, expressing disappointment, worry, and a hint of reproach all in one sigh. Wouldn't it be great if you were planning on giving us grandchildren instead? Eleanor has already given us Christian, and here you are, 30 years old, and you're not even dating anyone. I bit my tongue. It was the usual scenario at family gatherings, Eleanor mocking my frugality, Dad making jokes, Mom reminiscing about my loneliness. They knew I was saving for a house, they knew about my hardships, and the long hours, and the lack of vacation, but somehow none of that seemed like a worthy life goal to them. Christian's almost ready for college, Eleanor said proudly, changing the subject as if the previous one had been a warm-up. He's looking at some really good schools. That's great, I said, genuinely happy for my nephew. Christian was a good kid, despite his parents, smart, considerate, never joining in on the teasing, sometimes even cutting short with a quick but meaningful glance. Later that evening, as I was helping my mother wash the dishes, she touched my hand lightly, her fingers cold and shaking slightly, maybe from the water, maybe from the hesitation, because she always began these conversations with caution. "Honey, your dad and I need to replace the washing machine. It's making that awful noise again," she said. I sighed inwardly. It wasn't the first time. Small loans for appliances, home improvements, replacing a chair, unexpected medical bills, I already knew what it sounded like, and even though I was saving for a house, I always said yes, because family helps family, right? "How much do you need?" I asked, automatically reaching for my purse. $300, "We'll pay you back soon, I swear." I knew they wouldn't, but I took out the bills anyway. $300 meant I'd have to wear that same blue blouse Eleanor had mocked for another month. 2 weeks later, Eleanor called. Her voice, as always, sounded fast, a little tense, as if she was afraid to lose the thread of the conversation if she stopped for even a second, and, skipping the formalities, got straight to the point, outlining her request as if she were talking about something obvious. "I need a favor. Christian wants to take a programming course this summer. It's the perfect option for applying to college." I held the phone to my ear, trying not to exhale too loudly, to keep my irritation from escaping, because I knew how this conversation would end, and I knew that no one else could predict it like this. "How much?" I asked, dropping the pretense, deciding not to waste time on unnecessary emotion. When in conversations like this, feelings were more of a burden than a support. 800, Eleanor said, in the tone of someone who knew she was honoring me by allowing me to participate in an important milestone in her son's life. "It's an investment in his future," she added after a brief pause. That evening, as soon as I closed my laptop and turned off the lamp on the kitchen counter, I transferred the money and ate cheap ramen for dinner, not because there was nothing else in the fridge, but because I needed to remind myself why I was giving up the tasty, the trendy, the desirable. Every sacrifice brought me closer to my goal. It had been like this for years. I gave, they took, laughed at me behind my back or to my face, never stopping to consider the price I paid for even the smallest amount. They saw my restraint, my frugality, but they didn't see my determination, my monthly schedule, the Google Docs where I marked every income, every expense, every sacrifice, as if those boxes could protect me from failure and weakness. I didn't just dream of a house, I worked on it methodically, like an engineer calculating the load on a load-bearing beam, like a watchmaker assembling a complex mechanism with no room for error. Last week, I achieved my goal: 5 years of overtime, endlessly denied pleasures. No vacations, deprivation, unfair comments, accusations of stubbornness and loneliness. Meticulous budgeting and the ability to say no to everything except family requests finally bore fruit. I had enough for a down payment on a modest house, not fancy, not glamorous, but mine. And I couldn't stop smiling every time I checked my savings account balance, seeing the amount I'd worked for half my life become a reality. I decided to share the good news over Sunday dinner, because it felt like the moment had finally arrived, and maybe now they would understand why I'd said no for years, why I hadn't bought myself new shoes, why I worked nights when they were having parties. Maybe they'd even be happy for me, not in the same way they were happy for Eleanor and Christian, but at least in a real way, from the heart. I drove to my parents' country house with a bottle of sparkling cider in my bag, not champagne, of course, because the mortgage was already knocking on the door, but something to mark the occasion. When I pulled up, Eleanor's SUV was already in the driveway, its chrome wheels glinting, as if making a statement. "I am a success, I am the pride of the family." I took a deep breath, grabbed the cider, and headed into the house, hoping that this time the conversation would go differently. "There she is," Dad called from the living room, as if I were late for a play where the first scene had long since begun. "We were just talking about you." "That didn't sound very nice," I joked, forcing a smile that was more defensive than joyful, and walked into the room. Mom was bustling about in the kitchen, Eleanor and Romeo were sitting on the sofa, snuggled up with their glasses, and Christian was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had retreated back to his room to avoid hearing the adults' conversation. We sat down to dinner, and I waited patiently for the right moment, when a pause in the conversation would be long enough for me to interject my news without seeming rude. Dad had just finished telling another story about his golf buddy, who had won a trip to Spain for playing in an amateur tournament, and I was just starting to say, "Actually, I have some great news to share," when Eleanor, without waiting for me to finish my sentence, interrupted me with an enthusiasm that left no room for anything else. We have some pretty big news ourselves. I stopped talking because I knew she wouldn't stop until she'd said it all. Christian has been accepted to Sapienza University, she said, holding back a triumphant laugh. I looked at her and then at Romeo, who nodded as if to confirm her words. That's amazing, I said, and it was true. I was really impressed. Sapienza is no joke. It's one of the most prestigious universities in Europe, and getting in is a dream for any student. Congratulations, I added, looking her in the eye. Eleanor beamed with self-made pride, perhaps forgetting about the $800, it's his dream school, she said, squaring her shoulders. He's going to study computer science, he's going to make it, Romeo said, speaking with excitement for the first time. First in our family to go to college. I nodded, that's really cool, and then, as I tried to speak again, finally getting around to telling her about my home, Eleanor interrupted me for the third time. And this time her voice was no longer enthusiastic, but serious, even a little theatrical. Sapienza is expensive, very expensive. I froze, my fork on the edge of my plate. $50,000 a year, she said, looking at me with an expectant expression that might have seemed comical in other circumstances. The casserole I was eating suddenly seemed dry and tasteless, like paper. That's a lot of money, I managed to say, before Romeo, as if following a pre-rehearsed script, continued. Over the years, about 200,000 in total, but this is Sapienza, the connections alone are worth something. I looked around the table, their faces seemed closed, as if frozen in anticipation of a storm, and only their chewing movements, too measured, almost mechanical, betrayed the tense anticipation that hung in the air like a thick, invisible fog. Mom and Dad were strangely quiet, focused on their food, as if deliberately avoiding meeting my gaze, and all this evasive glances, restrained gestures, feigned calm, caused me growing anxiety. Something felt off, like I'd missed part of a conversation that had taken place before I arrived. Like the plot was already in progress and I'd just been thrown into the final scene without bothering to fill me in. How do you plan to pay for this? I asked Eleanor, trying to keep my voice casual, but my inner voice was already trembling with anticipation. And then it happened. All of them, Eleanor, Romeo, Mom and Dad, looked at me at the same time, as if on cue. And their faces reflected a mixture of anticipation, wariness, and something else that at first I couldn't place, but a second later I realized, hope, really, hope that I would, as always, do what was expected of me, lend a shoulder, swallow my own desires for the greater good. I felt a chill run down my spine, at first light, almost weightless, and then heavy, steely, penetrating to the bone. Well, Eleanor said slowly, as if testing my reaction, as if deciding how deep to plunge the knife, we've been talking about this as a family. Dad cleared his throat, and his voice sounded as if he was about to say something important, something he'd been thinking about for a long time. Mimi, you've always been so good with money, so responsible, he began, looking past me to the wall over my shoulder. Mom reached across the table and patted my wrist, her touch gentle but insistent, as if she were trying not so much to console as to anchor me to this reality. We know you've been saving for years, she said, and it all fell into place with sickening clarity. All those looks, this dinner, their unnatural goodwill, as if it had all been a performance with one purpose in mind, to make, at the right moment, a request they'd probably discussed for a long time, and apparently in complete agreement. I jerked my hand away from Mom's as if I'd been burned. Wait, are you asking me to pay for Christian's college? I asked, feeling each letter of the phrase become a weight in my throat. Not everything, Romeo said quickly, as if afraid I would reject the entire proposal outright, just the first year or two, then we'll figure something out. I laughed, not maliciously or hysterically, but with that bitter surprise you feel when your worst suspicions are confirmed. I couldn't help it. This must be a joke, you're not serious. But their faces told me they were dead serious. My dream of my own home, which was so close that I could practically feel the keys in my palm, heavy, cool, with a brand new metallic shine, it was carelessly destroyed over Sunday dinner, like a house of cards deflated by a light but treacherous sigh from my family. Mimi, Eleanor said, and her voice took on the condescending tone she had honed over the years, like a tool, gentle but caustic. We know you have savings, and you don't have a family to support. I'm buying a house, I said, and my voice was surprisingly calm, despite the mounting anger that was already pulsing in my temples. That's what I've been saving for. That's what I've been telling you all for years. My mother took a deep breath, and her face took on the look of noble compassion that usually comes from someone about to say something that they think will convince someone else of their wrongness. A house is just a thing, Mimi. Family is what's important. Christian is your nephew. And he's your grandson, I snapped, no longer hiding my anger. And Eleanor and Romeo's son, why is his education suddenly my financial responsibility? Eleanor's expression hardened. Because you can afford it, she said, as if that explained everything. You have what? 100,000 rupees saved up. That's more than enough for a down payment for the first 2 years of Christian's life. The fact that they had obviously discussed my finances and worked out the calculations without me made me feel physically ill. I pushed my plate away, no longer feeling hungry, tasteful, or even wanting to be there. I saved for 5 years, I said, unable to believe I had to explain this. 5 years of overtime, no holidays, and buying only the bare necessities. Do you have any idea how hard I worked for this? Oh, come on, Eleanor said, her expression more contemptuous than any schoolgirl's. You didn't work in a coal mine, you sit at a desk all day. Romeo leaned forward, his voice softer, almost gentle, as if he truly believed he was making sense. Look, Mimi, we're not asking for a handout. This is an investment in Christian's future. He's family. I stood up, my chair scraping across the floor, momentarily shattering the fragile balance of silence. I'm not giving you money for the house, I said, slowly, clearly, as if delivering a sentence. I can't believe you're even asking. My father's face darkened, his brows drawing together, and his voice took on the sternness he usually only used when reminding me who was boss. Listen here, young lady. We've supported you your entire life. Supported me? I almost screamed, but instead hissed through clenched teeth. You've mocked me for being thrifty for years, you've made fun of my clothes, my lifestyle, and now you want the money I saved, the money you've borrowed for years without paying back. Mom burst into tears, her go-to method, time-tested and appropriate every time words could no longer break through the opponent's logical wall, and the argument seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Tears were her last and most reliable currency. Especially when it came to family values, moral duty, and what was right. How can you be so selfish, she sobbed, her voice trembling with false surprise. Do you really not care about your nephew's future? I grabbed my purse from the counter, feeling my heart pounding in my chest like it was about to burst out. I care, Christian, I breathed out, frozen halfway to the exit. He's a great guy, kind, smart, he'll make it, but his college money was supposed to be your responsibility. I looked at Eleanor with the icy clarity that only comes in moments of extreme stress, not some afterthought you try to foist on me when you've run out of options. I headed for the door, my entire body shaking with a mixture of rage, distrust, and the pain that only betrayal by those you love can cause. You're greedy and selfish. Eleanor called after me, her voice shaking, not with remorse, but with the anger that comes from having your expectations dashed. We always knew it, but this is proof. You'll regret this, Mimi, Romeo added, his voice heavy, like a threat disguised as a prophecy. I heard my mother start to cry again, louder now, almost theatrically, as if she hoped the sound of her sobs would stop me, bring me back, soften me. My father began to swear, his voice muffled and strained, drowning out my mother's sobs, but I could no longer make out the words, because I had slammed the front door behind me with all my might. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely insert the key into the ignition, and only after several attempts did the car finally start, its engine humming as if sympathizing with my inner state. I drove aimlessly, without a clear destination, simply rushing away from this house, from the voices, from the reproaches, from the pain, trying to make sense of what had happened. I played their words over and over again, and with each repetition they became more and more alien, more and more absurd. My own family had been lying in wait for me, ambushed, trying to force me to give up on the dream I'd spent so many years building, brick by brick. The worst part wasn't even what they were asking for, it was that they seemed to genuinely believe they were entitled to my money, as if my efforts were their backup plan, their insurance in case things went wrong. Eventually, I pulled into a small cafe in the city center that was always quiet and cozy, especially in the evening. I needed to calm down, to catch my breath, before heading back to my empty, but mine, apartment. I ordered a cup of chamomile tea and sat at a corner table, away from the other customers, trying not to meet the waitress's eyes, unable to hide the sympathy I couldn't stand at this moment. My phone had been ringing nonstop since I'd left my parents' house, vibrating, ringing, stopping again, then starting up again, as if each ring was a blow to my temple. Finally, I looked at the screen. 17 missed calls and 23 messages. I scrolled through the messages, each one worse than the last. From Mom, I raised you better. Call me now. From Eleanor, you're talking nonsense, it's just money, family comes first. From Dad, your mom is crying because of you, I hope you're happy. I turned off the phone, not in anger, not in despair, but with the firm belief that they clearly weren't going to listen to reason today, and if they did, it would only be to prepare their next attack. The tea calmed me a little, it was hot, herbal, with a honeyed bitterness that reminded me of childhood, when everything seemed simple, when Mom was gentle and Dad was non-judgmental, when Eleanor and I could still laugh at the same things, but I still felt betrayed and angry, because years of patience, sacrifice, and perseverance, years of ridicule and neglect, turned out to be the fact that they now wanted to take away the only thing for which it all was for. When I got home, it was almost midnight, the streets were empty, the air was cool, and the windows of my house glowed with a soft yellow light, like a small lighthouse too, which I had finally swum. I turned on my phone again and found more messages, including voicemails, one after another, almost all from my mother and Eleanor, full of reproaches, complaints and manipulations. I ignored them all and fell into a restless sleep, where I argued again, justified myself again, heard myself being blamed again, and felt the walls closing in again. The next morning, I woke up with an unfamiliar but surprisingly strong sense of determination. I would not let them manipulate me anymore. I am Mimi, a 30-year-old woman who earned this money, every penny, and was going to spend it as intended, to buy a house, to build a life for herself in which she makes the decisions, and not the crowd with familiar smiles and endless complaints. I blocked their numbers temporarily. I needed time to think, without their constant pressure, their accusations, the guilt that comes with duty. But the respite was short-lived. By mid-afternoon my phone was ringing off the hook again, this time from unfamiliar numbers. When I finally answered one, it was Aunt Pam, Mom's sister, a guttural, judgmental woman who was always ready to take sides if it meant getting involved in drama. "Mimi, what are you hearing about refusing to help Christian?" she demanded, without even saying hello, and I felt the blood rush to my face again. So that was it. Mom activated the family phone tree. Like a panic button. "I don't think you understand the situation," I told Aunt Pam as calmly as I could, keeping my voice from shaking. "It's not that I'm refusing to help, it's about my family expecting me to give up all my savings." But she wasn't listening. She interrupted, she exclaimed, she moralized, and her voice was the same as everyone else's, sure that they were right, and that I was the only one who didn't understand. No one was right. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming, turning my phone into a weapon aimed directly at my vulnerability. Uncles, cousins, even my grandmother, who seemed to have not called me since I was in a school uniform, suddenly decided that now was the time to intervene. They all said the same thing, as if from a script written by one person, as if their mother had handed out the lines and made them memorize them. "You were selfish, you were greedy, you let the family down." I stopped answering unknown numbers, and then I started blocking my relatives one by one, not because I didn't care, but because I simply wouldn't have survived the onslaught otherwise. Each conversation followed the same script, and with each repetition it became more and more predictable, more and more tiresome. They began with quiet pressure, replete with words like "you understand" and "don't you see how hard it is for us," turned into furious accusations, hurtful remarks, jibes and reproaches, and ended with ultimatums and words that I could never have imagined from my own family before. No one asked my side of the story, no one was interested in how I felt, how I worried, how hard it was for me to get this money and why I suddenly found myself in the center of a family scandal, as if I was obliged to agree, silently and gratefully, to give up the result of all my sacrifices. No one even entertained the thought that maybe, just maybe, Eleanor and my parents might be wrong, might have gone too far, might have crossed a line that should never have been crossed. By Wednesday, I was emotionally exhausted, my head was pounding with pressure, my eyes were watering with fatigue, and I was sitting in my tiny apartment, hugging my knees, mindlessly scrolling through social media in an attempt to escape for a few minutes. to forget, to lose myself in other people's easier lives. And that's when I saw it, a long post from my mom, pinned to the top of her page, framed by the words family well-being like a wicked, ironic cliché. My stomach clenched as I read each line. My heart breaks for my grandson today, all his hard work, all his dreams, ruined by selfishness. Family is supposed to support each other, family is supposed to sacrifice for each other. I never thought I'd raise a daughter who would put material things above the future of her own flesh and blood. Please pray for our family during this difficult time. The comments were even worse. A wave of condemnation that rolled in like a tsunami and was unstoppable. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years voiced their opinions as if they had the full picture, as if they had been there when I worked late into the night, when I ate soup from a packet, when I washed by hand because the old machine had died and I didn't have the money for a new one. Cousins I used to play hide and seek with under the pine trees behind my grandmother's house as a child called me heartless, and one even accused me of envy. Even family friends, the same aunts and uncles I remembered from family celebrations, joined the crowd, their words hypocritical and their subtext venomous. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to buy a house, I would cut off contact with people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, without reservations, without false moralizing, but who, as it turned out, were not capable of it. The realization was painful. Like something dear had been ripped out and something cold and heavy had been inserted into it, but it was also liberating. I had spent so many years trying to please people who, as it now became obvious, had never seen me as a person, a living human being with dreams and pain, but only as a resource, a source of money, stability, a service. And when I was exhausted, they tried to take everything from me, every last drop. The next morning, I called Beatrice, the realtor whose business card had been gathering dust in my drawer for months, ever since I had dropped in at an open house and allowed myself to imagine for a moment that all this was possible. Her cheerful, confident voice was a pleasant change from the angry relatives I had had to deal with. I'm ready to start house hunting, I told her, trying to sound firm, like someone who wouldn't let herself be talked out of it again. My budget is set, but I'm pre-approved and can move quickly. That's music to my ears, Beatrice replied, and I couldn't help but smile for the first time in days. Let's meet and discuss what you're looking for, over coffee that weekend. In a cozy coffee shop with wooden tables and the scent of vanilla in the air, I shared my desire: a small house with a yard, preferably in a quiet area, away from noise, from other people's opinions, from pressure. Nothing fancy, but with a solid structure so I wouldn't have to worry about cracks, not in the walls, not in the heart. Beatrice wrote, nodded, clarified, and in her eyes there was no judgment, no doubt, no pity, only businesslike concern and professional interest. She promised to start organizing viewings immediately, and I knew I was finally moving forward. House hunting became my sanctuary. Every night after work and all weekend, I visited homes, peering into other people's kitchens, imagining how I would brew coffee there, looking into windows and wondering what curtains would go with those frames. Some houses were disappointments, water damage camouflaged by fresh paint, neighborhoods that felt unsafe, areas where the grass wouldn't grow and the neighbors were staring too hard. There were others that would require repairs I had neither the money nor the energy to do. But the process itself, as exhausting as it was healing. Each house I walked through, no matter how unsuitable, represented my independence and determination, my refusal to be a victim of other people's expectations. Meanwhile, the harassment from my family continued. They resorted to email, because I had blocked their calls and messages. The messages piled up in my inbox. Don't be like that, you'll let Christian down, you're embarrassing your mother. Eleanor's messages were especially harsh. She accused me of ruining Christian's life, as if I had destroyed all his achievements, his ambitions, his future with one no. My parents vacillated between anger, barely contained under the guise of disappointment, and attempts at manipulation, at which they had been masters since I was a child, and if it had worked before, now I had learned to discern the falsehood in my father's voice when he casually wrote, Dad's blood pressure is through the roof because of this situation, or in a tearful letter from my mother that ended with the line, or did we raise you better? As if my stubborn desire for autonomy, for independence, was not an act of strength, but a failure of their parenting skills. I deleted the letters without answering, because there was no request in them, only an accusation, a judgment veiled as concern. Now I was focused on only one thing: finding my home, not just a roof over my head, but a space in which I could finally breathe deeply and feel that I belonged to myself. After 3 weeks of endless viewings, a series of rejections, dashed hopes and disappointments, Beatrice called me with excitement in her voice. I could almost hear her fingers tapping on the table as she said, restraining her impatience, "I think I found it. The house just came on the market this morning. It fits your budget, but meets all your requirements. We agreed to see it that evening, and I wore the same blue blouse as always. Not because I had no choice but because it was a reminder that every limitation in the past had been part of my journey." As soon as I walked into the house, I knew it wasn't perfect. The old kitchen cabinets creaked when I touched them, the linoleum in the entryway was worn, and the backyard was overgrown as if no one had set foot there since last summer. But despite that, everything about it felt right. 2 bedrooms with sunny windows, 1.5 bathrooms, a small office that could easily be converted into a cozy guest room, and a covered porch that seemed tailor-made for morning coffee and a book. The house smelled of old boards, of a past life quietly retreating to make room for a new one. "What do you think?" Beatrice asked, but she didn't have to wait for an answer, because my face already said it all. "I want to make an offer," I said, and in that moment the world shifted. Everything I had worked for was now standing before me in the form of this modest, but mine, home. The next few days passed in a haze of paperwork, inspections, and negotiations, where every document, every signature was a step toward my goal. The seller accepted my offer with few conditions, and suddenly it was real. I was buying a house. The deadline for the sale was set for 3 weeks, and I immediately filed my notice to vacate my apartment, began packing things into boxes, sorting through clothes, books, kitchen utensils with a familiar motion, and tried my best to ignore the ongoing consequences of my increasingly public family situation. My mother's social media campaign had escalated to daily posts, long, emotional posts about Christian's devastating disappointment, about his dream dying, about how everything he worked for was wasted because of one man's selfishness. Of course, they conveniently forgot to mention that Christian had options: 2 years of community college and then transfer, scholarships, student loans, choosing a school based on his means, but those options didn't give them access to my money, and so they weren't even considered viable. They didn't want Christian's path, they wanted control over me, and when I refused, they chose the path of destruction. The day of the deal arrived, and I signed my name 100 times, filling in the blanks, checking my signatures, smelling the fresh paper and ink. When Beatrice finally handed me the keys, a small bundle of metal with a tag with my name handwritten on it, I couldn't stop smiling. I had done it. Against all odds, I had achieved my goal. Moving day was set for the following weekend. I had little furniture, another reason my family had ridiculed me, but that also made the process easier. Several colleagues from work, hearing about my move, offered to help, and by Sunday evening my modest belongings were neatly arranged in my new home: boxes of books along the walls, a kettle on the stove, a ficus tree by the window. I spent the next 2 weeks settling into my new routine. The commute to work had become a little longer, but I didn't mind it. In fact, those morning commutes became a time to collect my thoughts, listen to music, dream about the future. I bought a few necessary pieces of furniture: a Real bed with a wooden headboard to replace the old futon, a dining table with 2 chairs, a comfortable reading chair for the living room, where the sunlight now diffused in the mornings. I planted flowers in a small garden by the front door, a few geraniums, lavender, a couple of rose bushes, and each small action felt like a statement: this is my home, this is my life, I choose this. I tried not to tell any of my family my new address. As far as they knew, I still lived in my old apartment, on the top floor of a building with thin walls and a broken elevator. I'd stopped answering their texts a few weeks ago, and the silence that followed was almost ethereal, blissful. At first it was oppressive, because I was used to living with the background noise of their voices, their expectations, their demands, but soon I began to breathe easier. I was finally beginning to heal from their betrayal, not because it stopped hurting, but because I finally allowed myself to admit that a family that demands sacrifice from you and rejects you when you refuse to make it is not love, it is a debt trap disguised as kinship. And so one Tuesday, as the day was drawing to a close and the desks in the office were starting to empty, I threw on my jacket as usual, grabbed my bag, said goodbye to my colleagues, and walked out of the office building, looking forward to an evening cup of tea and the silence of my new home. but before I could take more than a few steps, I froze. Right out front, in the visitors' parking area, was my parents' sedan, gray and beige, with a familiar scratch on the front bumper that my father had never bothered to fix. My heart sank, and the unpleasant premonition turned into a sharp pain in my stomach when I saw that there were 4 people standing next to the car: my mother, father, Eleanor, and Romeo. They were huddled together, as if preparing to attack, and it was immediately clear that this was not a chance meeting or a fleeting desire to greet a daughter they had not seen for a long time. I thought about diving back into the building, hiding among the glass walls and concrete columns, but they had already noticed me, and their faces immediately wore forced smiles and a feigned gentleness that was hard to believe for a second. There was no way to avoid this confrontation. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders and walked towards them, each step resembling a movement through viscous water, through the crushing tension that had accumulated over all these weeks. "Mimi," my mother spoke first, her voice stern and coldly reproachful, as if I were a child who had disobeyed her parents and missed curfew. "We've been trying to contact you for weeks." I stayed at a safe distance, unwilling to close that gap either physically or mentally. "I blocked your numbers for a reason," I said, my voice guarded. "I have nothing to say to you." Eleanor immediately stepped forward, her designer handbag with the brand's bright logo swinging smugly on her arm, as if demonstrating who had the right to the truth. "You can't just cut your family off because you don't want to help," she said accusingly, as if my boundaries were a whim and her demands a sacred duty. "I'm not going to discuss this here," I replied, glancing at my colleagues who had begun to leave the building, watching our conversation with curiosity, the tension palpable even from a distance. "Well, you're not answering our calls, so you're leaving us no choice," Dad said, and I saw his face flush with anger, his jaw tense. "This is an important family matter. Christian's tuition deposit is due next week," Romeo added, crossing his arms over his chest as if he were trying to assert his position, at least outwardly. "We need to take action." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I was so shocked by their audacity, this certainty that after weeks of harassment and ignoring my boundaries, I could still give in to their demands, that my no was temporary, that I was just waiting to be pushed. "I don't know where you thought the money was coming from," I said, my voice low, but every word cold steel. "But it's definitely not coming from me. I bought a house. The deal closed 2 weeks ago." The shock on their faces was almost comical. My mother's jaw dropped, and she looked from me to my father, confused. My father's bushy eyebrows had shot up until they almost met the line of his receding hairline. Eleanor looked as if she'd been slapped, her lips white and her fingers clutching the strap of her purse. You bought a house?" Mom whispered, as if she didn't believe what she'd heard, "without telling us?" "Why?" I answered calmly, "So you could try to stop me? So you could force me to give the money to Christian?" Selfish, Eleanor hissed, taking a step toward me. "You knew how important this was to Christian, and yet you still went and spent the money." "I'm not backing down," I said. "It was my money, Eleanor. I worked for it, I saved for it, I sacrificed for it. While you and Romeo went on vacation and bought new cars, I worked overtime and shopped at thrift stores. You can't call me selfish." The security guard from my building approached us. A tall man with a serious face, wearing a uniform with our company logo. I recognized him as Diego, the one who always gave me a friendly nod in the morning and held the door for me when he saw me walk in with a coffee in one hand and my laptop in the other. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, looking straight at me, ignoring the others. "Miss Wallace, are they bothering you?" I hesitated for just a second. "Yes, they are," I said firmly. I was just about to leave, and then they started making a big fuss. "We're not done, Mimi," Eleanor said sharply, her voice starting to break. "Actually, we are," I said, and in that moment, a sudden clarity dawned on me, as if everything that had been building up inside had finally found a release. "We're completely done. I'm cutting ties with all of you. Don't call me. Don't email me. Don't show up at my desk. If you continue to stalk me, I will file for a restraining order." "You can't be serious," Mom gasped, stepping forward. "We are your family. Family wouldn't do what you did to me," I said with a firmness I'd never felt in myself before. "Family wouldn't bully you for years and then demand your savings. Family wouldn't turn your entire family against you when you refused to be their wallet. Family wouldn't think you were owed just because you learned to survive without them." Diego stepped forward. "Friends, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You're disturbing an employee's peace." this isn't over," Eleanor threatened as Romeo caught the guard's eye, grabbed her elbow, and pulled her toward the car. "You can't just walk away from your family, look at me," I said, turning and heading toward my car, feeling something old and heavy crumble behind me. My parents hesitated, unsure of what to do. Their faces were filled with confusion and anger, fear, and bewilderment. "Mimi, please," I heard my mother's voice, muffled, almost pleading, "we can work this out." Without looking back, I got into the car and drove to my new home, to my quiet, hard-won, honestly won refuge, where every corner was filled with my breath, my will and my work, and not with someone else's expectations and demands. For the first time since that ill-fated family dinner that changed everything. For the first time in long weeks of pain, resentment, humiliation and rage, I felt truly free, as if I had thrown off the invisible chains to which I had been chained all my life. I defended my right to my own life, and, as it turned out, the world did not collapse. On the contrary, it became more spacious, brighter, cleaner, as if with the arrival of my know a fresh wind had burst through the windows. The feeling of guilt that they had tried to load on me inexorably, insidiously, for years, disappeared with every mile that separated us, and I caught myself thinking that for the first time in a long time I did not want to justify myself, or explain, or make peace. Autumn turned to winter, and as the first snow fell like a fluffy blanket on the rooftops and the trees stood silently in a delicate lace veil, I decorated my house for the holidays, not for anyone else, not for approval or tradition, but because I wanted to. It was my first Christmas in my own home, and every element, the wreath on the door, the small but fluffy tree in the corner of the living room, the garlands scattered around the windows, shimmering with soft light, was a symbol of a new chapter, my chapter. I hosted a dinner for friends from work, a modest, cozy evening full of laughter, the aroma of spices and hot chocolate, no drama, no guilt, no awkward pauses when someone starts reminiscing about how things used to be better, just kind faces, sincere conversations, and the simple joy of being together. I hadn't heard from my family since we bumped into each other outside my office, and the silence wasn't just pleasant, it was healing, like a balm for my soul. I started therapy because I realized that for too many years I had lived in a distorted reality, where manipulation was disguised as care, and emotional abuse was disguised as parenting and love. I was getting to know myself again, my desires, my boundaries, my rights. I joined a hiking club, took pottery classes, made crooked but beautifully imperfect cups and plates, made new friends who didn't know my history, my family, and therefore perceived me without filters or labels. And then one cold January day, when the wind lashed against the windows, as if trying to knock me out of my peace, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored him, but something in the tone of the silence made me hit the answer button. "Aunt Mimi." The voice on the other end of the line was hesitant, almost timid. "Christian, I didn't expect to hear from my nephew. Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice soft. "Yes, I'm fine, I just wanted to talk to you, to explain a few things." We agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop downtown, the same one that sold my favorite bergamot tea with nut cookies, and all morning I had been running through the possibilities of what he might say in my head. I arrived early, ordered tea, and chose a table by the window. When Christian walked in, I didn't recognize him for a moment. He looked older, more mature, more serious. There was confidence in his movements, a sense of his own path in his eyes. "Thank you for meeting," he said, sitting down opposite me. "Of course," I said, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through my chest. "I missed you." Christian looked down at his cup. "I want you to know that I never asked them to ask you for money. It wasn't my idea." "I know," I said softly. "I never blamed you. Mom and Dad wanted me to go to Sapienza because it was prestigious. They always talked about the connections I'd make, the status, how good it would sound to have their son there." He sighed, then added, "But I got a partial scholarship. It's a good school, and with my scholarship, my part-time job, and my savings, I can manage. It's my choice." We talked for over an hour. Christian talked about his classes, his roommate, his inspiring professors, and his plans for the future, which included a startup, a volunteer program, and a move. He was thriving despite not having the expensive education his mother had asked me to sacrifice everything for. "I don't want you to think I'm on their side," he said as we were about to leave. "What they did was wrong." "Thank you for saying that," I said, genuinely touched. "And if anything, I'm very proud of you." We hugged, and I watched him go from the window, feeling something fragile and warm blooming inside me for the first time in a long time, a mixture of sadness and hope. I had lost my parents and my sister, but maybe not all was lost. Spring came, and with the first green leaves and the ringing songs of birds came my housewarming. I had put it off until winter, concentrating on making the house truly mine. I painted the walls warm, created a garden, planted mint and chamomile, chose furniture that reflected my essence, simple, comfortable, but with character. Now it was time to celebrate. I invited friends, from work, from the hiking club, from ceramics classes. No family, no relatives, only those who accepted me as I was, who did not judge my path, did not try to reshape me to suit their needs, and did not look at me as a source of something that could be taken away. Looking around at the smiling faces in the living room, I realized that I had not lost my family. I had simply found another version of it, more honest, more sincere, people who rejoiced in my successes, and did not ridicule them, people who offered support without expecting payment in return, people around whom you didn't have to be strong every day, you could just be yourself. Write a comment what you think about this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.